Greetings and welcome everyone to a new episode of the Dreambuildrs podcast. I am very excited for this episode, not only because it's the last one for this year, but also because we have an amazing guest today. And I'm very delighted to introduce to you Gill Mckay. Now, Gill is an applied neuroscience trainer, coach, speaker, and worked for more than 20 years with coaches, trainers, HR, and business professionals to amplify their results through using neuroscience in their work. Gill is also the co-founder of MyBrain International and the author of the best-selling book, Stuck, Brain Smart Insights for Coaches. Now, today we're going to talk about neuroscience and in particular about Gill's passion, which is how to make friends with your brain. And I'm very excited to know more about this, especially how you can create a better life and really truly embrace your uniqueness. So, Gill, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So where shall we start this conversation? I feel like I would love to know a little bit more about you and your passion, because you have worked for more than 20 years in this particular topic, neuroscience. So, what led you to become so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, you'll have to stop me because it's potentially a long story.
Okay.
I think because it's all about the passion, and I think the passion comes from various sources, and it gets reiterated and it evolves as we move forward. And when I actually look back, my story starts, or my passion story starts from when I was a youngster. I was born with a cardiac condition that, which it's so interesting. So many years ago, it had a sort of mortality rate with it. It was a severe hole in my heart. Nowadays, it's just incredible. It's not quite a daycare operation, but it's a completely different thing. Things just evolve so much. The reason I mention this is because I felt really different from a lot of my peer group at the time. And I didn't know then that this would be the basis for me nowadays, with my passion of really helping people to enjoy their difference, to enjoy their uniqueness. When I reflect back on that period, I enjoyed my uniqueness. Yes, there were some things that were different from, or many things that were different from my peer group. Like I was on half-day schooling for a while. I had to have regular trips to hospital. I guess I kind of intuitively knew I wasn't well. So of course there were things that were different, but I was also me. I think I had a really healthy sense of who I was. And then sort of fast forward now into the world of work. I was one of those lucky people who landed in a role that I really loved. So I was in the whole lovely remit of learning and development. So I've always been in training, facilitation, coaching. And the neuroscience angle came, we were talking probably about the late 90s. That came about when I was working with my opposite number in North America. I ran the corporate university for leadership, in the leadership school in the corporate university for Europe. And my opposite number in America, his uncle was a neuroscientist. And it was just at that stage where neuroscience was beginning to see that there were applications beyond just the medical and the clinical sphere, that actually knowing a bit about our brain is really additive for us as people in day-to-day life as well as business. So as a consequence of that, we did a little bit of research, what little was known then, and we started to weave some brain science, neuroscience messages into our leadership training programs. And hence my whole passion started to come about around making friends with your brain. Because when we understand at that sort of brain level that physically we can make a difference, when we physically make a difference in our own bodies, when we decide to change our thought patterns and decide to try new things and bring change into our life, that can be really, really appealing for people and really grounding. And of course, there is nothing more unique than your brain. So a lot of my work is about helping people to just really ground themselves and embrace the fact that they're different, which is such a wonderful place to be. We all have our own difference, our own uniqueness to bring to the world. So founded from when I was a youngster, and evolved all the way throughout the years, throughout my teenage and life, my university life, but mostly in my working life. I think I was at a really good pivotal point when that science started to become more accessible in the business world.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Gill. And I would love to know, because before we talk about neuroscience and like the kind of steps to make friends with your brain. I would love to know more about that. I'm very particularly interested in you because you said like kind of from a young age, you have been very well aware of your uniqueness and
Yeah,
you had a healthy sense of who you were. Can you
yeah.
perhaps explain a little bit how you found that within yourself or how you did that?
Yeah, well, I think it was a mix of finding that within myself. I think when you are forced, I guess, into a situation, with your growing brain as a youngster, where you recognize, you realize that your life is different to your peer group, because peer group is so important to all of us when we're growing up. I think almost at a subconscious level, that forces you to perhaps ask some adult questions of yourself and start to build some of that self-awareness, because I needed to land and understand, why was it me that was in hospital? Why was it me that was on half-day schooling? Why was it me that wasn't allowed to do the physical education when I was at a certain stage in my illness? So I think that health, and I do like to use the word healthy. I don't know whether I've been born positive. I mean, we might be able to talk about that a little bit later. But I was also surrounded by great positivity. So, and when I look back, my parents were absolutely remarkable. They were both doctors. I mean, they've gone now, so hence the past tense. They're both doctors, and to some degree, I think it's even more remarkable because they were both doctors. They would have understood, perhaps more than lay people, that their child was ill, and yet they were, they had more knowledge, if you like, and experience around that. And yet they have created this incredible positive environment for my brother, my sister, and myself. And I remember my mum saying to me when I was probably about 8 or 9, she kind of invoked this idea of uniqueness with me. Well, I don't think that was her intention, but it was all about making me feel better. And I remember her saying to me, just be you, Gill, because everyone else is taken. Now, amusingly, I've subsequently seen that quote attributed to Einstein. So whether my mum read it or not, I don't know. I just love it.
Yeah.
Be you, because everyone else is taken. It's such a powerful thing. And for me, even as a youngster, I guess my parents were, encouraging me that despite some of my illnesses, that everything was great and I could still have a fabulous life, and the choices it was all about my own choice around that. So I think it was twofold. I think I forced myself to ask myself some great questions, because I was living a different life from my friends, but also the environment around me encouraged that perpetual realism, the positivity as well. And I think that really helped me on my way into that healthy sort of mindset when I was a youngster.
Wow.
Yeah, very fortunate. I really do
So, yeah,
count my
it sounds like
blessings.
fortunate growing up like that, and to
Yes,
get that kind
yes.
of wisdom already at such a young age is
Yeah,
super, super important
yeah.
for your self-development as well, right? And for
In
seeing.
some ways, I think, I had to grow up quite fast because we were facing some quite challenging decisions around various medical procedures. But, I've always had that kind of positivity attached to it. And I hugely thank my parents for the environment that they created around that.
Yeah. Wow. So Jill, let's move to the brain. I'd love
Let's
to.
move to the brain.
I
Love
would
it.
love to know more about, ultimately how we can make more friends with our brain, but also let's start from a point that should be simple. I mean, like from school onwards, we haven't really been trained into what the brain can do for us, right? So we just
Right.
use it on a daily basis and we get into routines and we don't think about what's happening. So can you tell us perhaps a little bit about, I know you love this, like what the neuro myths actually are, and
Oh,
what
yes.
what some of the myths are about the brain, so that we can debunk that and start
Yeah.
from that point, and then we can start, how can we resolve those issues?
Yeah, so I mean, we really could have a podcast of 10 hours here. Absolutely. So
Okay.
you'll have to contain me. Absolutely. I think it's really important. I'm glad you put that on the table about the myths, because as with anything that is popular or fashionable, and let's face it, neuroscience is popular or fashionable, inevitably many people climb on the bandwagon and want to be part of it. Of course they do, because it is creating an impact in all of our worlds today. And then inevitably there are some misinterpretations, some exaggerations, some embellishments, and all of those things that are popular psychology and popular neuroscience is all about. So what we do in our business is we like to say that we help to debunk the myths, but also that we like to say that we make neuroscience accessible, because on one side you've got the really weighty academia, which is fabulous, and that's where the research comes to play, with all the university research, the clinical, the medical research, the psychological research, and all of it joining up. And then at the other end, you've got the popularized, some of which is very valid, the popularized interpretation of what neuroscience is about. So I like to kind of think that we're the bridge in the middle to interpret this. So we'll all have read about so many of these myths, like, oh, you only use 10% of your brain, so think about that 90% untapped potential. So I like that as a marketing message. I like the whole essence of untapped potential, but hey, we use all of our brains all of the time. Because a big part of our brain keeps our body going. We do not consciously think about blinking or swallowing or keeping the saliva going on in our mouth. It's our brains doing that as a subconscious level. So we use all of our brains all of the time. We do develop preferences for doing things in a particular way. So we may not be pulling upon every single neural pathway all of the time, because we do have these patterns. You referred to the patterns and routines, but this is a myth to say you only use 10% of your brain. So yes, take the other part of that. There's so much untapped potential within us, but we are using our brains. We can potentially consciously use it in a more proactive way with different choices, and you'll still be using all of your brain. But by doing things in a conscious way, you will be firing up and expanding neural pathways for those activities that you want to do. I think the other one that's really well often talked about, and again I understand why, is left brain, right brain. So it is true that there are certain parts of the brain that are, from a physical point of view, that are highly what they call lateralized. So you do have more of a lateral right side, a lateral left side, and there are different functions that each of those will perform within a healthy human brain. But it's not the regions themselves, it's the networks that matter. So you've got networks firing the information across between the right hand side and the left hand side of the brain. What's the popularized thinking says that the left brain is all about analysis and logic and I say linear thinking, if you like, process. The right brain's all about creativity and connections. And it can't be that pure. So what we do know through experimentation is, and what the academics tell us, is that there may be more activity taking place on the right-hand side if you are doing a project that involves a lot of idea generation. But also ideas do occur on the other side of the brain. So somebody who, say, has a preference, who really loves working in a process-based manner, a beginning, a middle, and the end, they generate their ideas in a different way from somebody who just spontaneously makes connections. So it's again, it's helpful, I think, to understand that if you may be more left-brained, and I'm putting this in inverted commas for the listeners on the podcast, if you enjoy process and analysis, and more right-brained if you enjoy that sort of spontaneity. But it doesn't mean you're not using the other side of the brain. It is a misnomer and a myth to say you are only left brain and you're only right brained. And the beautiful thing about the brain is, and we know this through brain injury, is that if perhaps parts of the left brain or parts of the right brain were injured in an accident, we could relearn to operate using different regions of the brain, because it's a network that matters. Just as if we tend to have preferences for using a right or a left hand, and if one of them was injured, I think I'd find it quite tough to learn to write with my left hand, but I could do it. Through practice and repetition, I could bring new patterns out. So I think we need to be careful to a degree, maybe that's too strong a word, but because of course a lot of what is written is true and useful. The other thing, and this isn't a myth, this is truth, is that, and I can't give you a percentage on it, but we know we don't know everything about the brain. So I think one thing I read, so it's probably could be a myth, I don't know if it's true. I think in the 2010, it was George Bush that declared the coming decade, the decade of the brain. And it might have been 2000, I think, I can't remember which one it was, but the forward decade, the decade of the brain. And at that stage, I read an article that said, we only know 3% of what there is to know about the brain. And that really confused me, because I thought, how do we know that there's still 97% to find out?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so the reality is there will be, you'll read an awful lot, and I'm not saying, oh, take it all with a pinch of salt. I'm not saying that. It's just that some of the stuff, it just, in order for us to be able to understand in a generalized sense, there will be some mythology within there, but that does not mean to say that it will all be useless, not at all. You know, learning a little bit about the brain can be really, really liberating and really helpful for people.
Yeah, well, and luckily there is still a lot to learn for us when it comes to the brain, right? If we look at it like that.
Whether it's 97% or 50%, there's more to learn.
Exactly. Now, Joe, could you explain us, because you told some of the myths, like what it means for you to make friends with your brain? Can you explain that for people?
Well,
and not only that, but also what you think is the most important thing to start doing that. I think that will be also.
Okay, so I think,
important.
I mean, I often work, I work with coaches a lot, so I help coaches to bring neuroscience into their work, to add a layer, if you like, to their learning. So in no way, shape or form is it around replacing any of the skills that they have. It's just about adding another layer. And I think one of the most important things about neuroscience is that neuroscience helps people to, I guess, understand why they act the way they do. So what we do in coaching is we're helping people to try things on for size, to try new actions, to perhaps effect the change that they want to create within their life. And we're facilitating those conversations. And so we help them with the how. This is how you can do this. This is what you can do. You know, they're coming up with the suggestions themselves. Whereas neuroscience is almost more foundational, and a little bit of understanding with the client around what's happening inside their brain helps them understand that, okay, this is why this is happening. So, you know, I'm stuck within this particular pattern because I've automated it. And actually, I'm responding in that automatic way to that particular trigger. So if I want to change and make friends with my brain, I need to put my brain working for me rather than against me. I need to now consciously unpick the habit, for instance, that I'm stuck with. So a lot of it, okay, is about using different language, and just, I'm not at all about necessarily teaching our clients content all the time, so talking, but just a little bit of language can help people to reframe things and unpick things in a different way. So for instance, one of the things we do know when we just talk about the evolution and the structure of the brain is that around 80% of our neurons, or our brain cells, and that the activity in the networks operate in the more ancient parts of the brain, so the parts that also keep our body going and keep homeostasis going, and operate in our, I'm about to come out with a myth, but it's a word, emotional brain. By the way, we don't have an emotional brain in a logical way, but where most of where we know those parts of the brain and the networks reside when we feel and we sense something, rather than perhaps the difference of when we think something. And just at its simplest, for some of my clients, when they understand that, that amount, that sort of 4/5, 80% of their neurons operating in that whole emotional, intuitive, instinctive, more ancient part of the brain, it can be really liberating and help them to be able to surface feelings. And I think that's very useful for some people, particularly if they work in, really sort of gung-ho or organizations that are all about, respecting, the thinking and the analysis and the logic and the metrics. By the way, that's great. But also I'm
Well,
being very careful about what I say. But for those people that are more naturally emotionally intelligent, where that emotional intelligence really matters for them, it almost gives them permission to be them, and kind of think, yeah, hey, 80% of my brain cells are blooming well working in this scenario. And I think at an even more fundamental level, when people recognize that when they're making a conscious change, let's say hypothetically to change a habit, to change a routine, when they recognize and build awareness of a routine that they're stuck in is no longer serving them well, and they're making that conscious effort to change that habit, when they recognize that they are actually physically rewiring their brain, they have the power to do that. That's also very liberating, because it's also, it helps to keep the motivation going. I know that if I do this every day for the next 100 days, 200 days, 30 days, I'm helping myself to be able to genuinely lay down stronger neural pathways, because the brain learns through repetition. And what happens with as we repeat things, we get a reward for doing it. And as we repeat it, because we're getting this dopamine, it's a bit more complex than that, but because we're getting a hit of some sort of reward, we want to do it again. So we're keeping our motivation going by repeating doing things. And when we're aware that this is actually happening, it kind of adds to our motivation to continue, even when things start to feel a bit tough, keep things conscious and continue to rewire ourselves, because we are doing that all the time. And when we consciously get that, that can be really liberating and empowering.
Wow. All right. So this was a long story, but what I loved about it is, you were talking about change and building new habits.
Yeah.
That it's very important to be, to retrain your brain as well, and so that you can expand neural pathways and repeat that message. And I think something that's very important as well is when you're making a change. And what I would love to know more about is how you can reward yourself then. Like, what are some examples of the way that you can reward yourself so that you can keep on having that inner motivation to initiate that change as well? I think that's also, something very important.
Yeah, it
Is it?
absolutely is. And again, to keep it conscious. So there's quite a lot in your question there. So a habit is made up in its really simplest sense of a trigger, so a cue, then your action, your behavior, and then the reward. And I think it is, and rewards can be both extrinsic and intrinsic. So by that, it can be buy myself a new dress if I lose 10 pounds at Christmas time, yeah, and that's very visible, yeah, and external. Or it can be, intrinsic, just to feel fantastic about yourself, to feel healthy, to have, better skin, or whatever it might be. You're feeding your skin in that way. And so, but here's the thing about rewards. Your brain does not know at that subconscious level whether the reward is of having the new beautiful black dress, or whether the reward could be as simple as keeping you in a familiar pattern, because the brain wants to keep you safe. And the brain tends to resist change, because change exposes you to risk. Yeah. And the brain really is a survival machine, and we want to, if we're in a pattern of doing something that isn't having dreadful consequences for us, but if it's okay, then the brain will work quite hard to keep you in those particular patterns. So when you're working with a client who kind of recognizes that, yeah, I want to change a habit, it's really important to unpick the habit to the trigger. So let's recognize what your cue is. Is it 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you want a glass of wine, for instance? We tend to, as coaches, work on the behavior. Yeah, so let's change your thought. Let's have a different pattern at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But it's as important to look at that cue, see what you can do around the cue, as well as the behavior and the rewards. So, of course, what we can do ourselves, rewards, are those extrinsic rewards, the external rewards. We can, reward ourselves with a new black dress, or a new handbag, or a walk, or a drink of water, or a standing up, and reading a book, or a TED talk. That's my go-to. I reward myself with with learning,
I love
and
that.
do something different. But I do it in a different room. We have a family computer in a different room. So it's a get up and go reward. And now what's interesting is that was a reward. It's now become a pattern. It's now become a habit. So, I feel that if I don't get that reward, then I need to do something consciously about it. So much around making friends with your brain and about habit change is conscious thinking, just bringing it to our attention, chunking things down. Don't keep them too big, little habits, celebrating small wins, reward. And that's another point about reward. A conscious reward to yourself can be just as easy as being kind to yourself and saying, well done, you've achieved that today. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's nice if you get a Mulberry handbag, but hey, just saying, well done, and using proactive, positive, encouraging, motivating language with yourself can be super rewarding.
All right. So, like, when we're talking about habit change, right? Like, I've read several studies on the amount of days that it takes to incorporate a new habit. Like, what is your vision on it? How like, is there a certain, is there really like 66 days? Is it 20 days? Like, what's your vision on it?
Yeah, this is the answer that I think everybody dreads. It depends. Absolutely. I love that research. 66 days was very popular a couple of years ago. I think it was a University College London research, and it was really valid in the context within which they did the experimentation. I think what was really valid and useful about that piece of research was the fact that prior to that, popularized, and I'm not saying it's a myth, because it will depend, but people were talking about 30 days, 1 month before that.
Yeah.
So I think it was really useful to say, actually, it could very well be longer. And it depends. It depends on on the habit, and it depends how many triggers and associations you have with the habit. So let's say hypothetically it's smoking. You wanted to give up smoking, quit smoking, and there are lots of programs to do so. You might, maybe even at a subconscious level, equate smoking with something that you used to do with your late grandfather. Hypothetically, it might be something that you enjoyed doing, sharing a cigar or a cigarette or a pipe maybe with your grandfather, and so therefore it's retaining those memories for you. You may associate smoking with success, that you always went off to, if you struck a deal when you were working in the early 90s or whatever, you'd go to the wine bar and you'd have a cigar, for instance. So it's more complex. It's not as binary as perhaps we may think. Perhaps starting the habit of a daily walk, or a walk, and you want to get to a daily walk, is maybe a little bit more binary than perhaps something as ingrained as smoking. So I think these studies are extremely useful, and I think what they do is they put a really useful time frame, whether it's 66, 67, 65, 92, 42, they put a time frame into people's heads so that we know that this isn't going to happen tomorrow, without willpower. From a pattern and laying down those pathways perspective, it's not going to take half a day. It will take time. So I think it helps people chunk and plan. They're really, really useful in that. It depends what it is. Yeah.
All right. So I want to move into one of the last questions, because I'm looking at the time, just to be aware. Let me think what we've all thinking. I think it's very important, like we're talking about habit change now, like we talked about rewarding, we talked about setup, like triggers, repetition. What do you think is the most important thing when you want to start initiating a new habit for people? Like,
I think you may think this is a tangent, but I cannot emphasize this more for all of us. What is good for our body is good for our brain. So if you want to change a habit, do something new, you need to look after yourself, and you need to be in the right frame, not just of mind, but frame of body. Let's coin a new phrase there. So hydration, sleep, nutrition, exercise, fresh air, all of those things. When we are making good lifestyle choices, we're far more likely to stay motivated and keep on track with our habit change, because we're nourishing, we're feeding our bodies, but we're also feeding our brains. We're giving our brain the greatest chance to be able to create change in a really happy way. I'm really interested in the topic of sleep. And what we do know from neuroscience is that less than 7 hours of continuous sleep, really gets in the way of you being able to make great decisions the next day. So that would get in the way of you being able to be motivated to keep with your habit change exercise. So simple answer, but look after your body, look after your brain.
Wow, I love that. I was just thinking about that, the 7 hours of sleep. I'm a fresh parent, a kid of 1.5 years, so I often don't get that much amount of sleep. So I really need to start thinking about nourishing my body very well. So that's super important, Jill. Now, in the beginning, we talked about that there's still a lot to discover about the brain, whether it's 60% or 97%. What is something that you still want to find out, or something that you're very curious about knowing more?
Oh, for me, I want to learn more about instinct, and that whole, an area that I'm actually studying next year as well, is around, and it is related to instinct, is the whole area of embodied learning. So when we change our thoughts, how we actually sense and feel that within the changes within our bodies, because the whole mind-body connection is absolutely true, but what is it that we can do to know at a body level as well as a brain level that we are affecting change? So really interested in the whole research around intuition, instinct, and embodied learning, and let's just add another one, the whole spirituality sphere. So there's a lot to learn.
Oh wow. Okay, that's amazing, especially when we're talking about intuition. That's also a topic that we still don't know a lot about, especially when it comes to scientific measures and stuff.
Yes,
And
yeah.
and real research. So that's very interesting. I would love to have you back when you know more about that.
Well, I hope it's still going in 30 years.
Yeah. We would have something to talk about.
Lovely,
So Jill,
thank you.
thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for sharing all of your inspirational insights and your wisdom here.
Thank you, great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Before you go, please share with us what are the best places that people can find you and your work.
Absolutely. So for me, I post every day except the weekends on LinkedIn and Instagram. So hop over to see me on LinkedIn. You can just see my name at the bottom here, Gill Mckay. It's LinkedIn with just my name. And that would be fantastic. I'd be delighted to connect and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jill. And looking forward to talk soon.
Excellent. Me too. Thank you.
Thank you.